I do think that it's been striking and even to some extent like unseemly how much some of the DC think tank establishment has embraced HTS, including some of the very same people who in 2016 or so were arguing that their break with Al-Qaeda was totally fake. And I can understand why there would be a concern that there's going to be a whitewashing of JNIM, that there's sort of the ground is being prepared for JNIM to run Mali. I myself, though, have long felt that some kind of negotiated settlement or negotiated outcome dialogue with JNIM would be the way to go because I think it would save lives.
Hello and welcome to Protean View. I'm Mohammed Saeed Bushra and I'm joined for this episode by Alexander Thurston, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Cincinnati. Alex has published 3 books on Islam and Muslim groups in West Africa. Salafism in Nigeria, published in 2016, Boko Haram, The History of an African Jihadist Movement, published in 2018, and Jihadists of North Africa and the Sahel, published in 2020. Our topic today is the recent developments in Mali and neighboring countries. Before the discussion begins, a quick thank you to our supporters, without whom this episode would not be possible. If you like what we do here at Protean View, please consider joining our community on Substack at muftah.org and Patreon at patreon.com/proteanview, which you can do for as low as $5 a month. To help us keep this show running, please do follow and rate us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and wherever else you find your podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for our newsletter at muftah.org to stay updated on the latest from us. Thanks for listening and for your support. And here now is my conversation with Alex Thurston. Alex, welcome to the podcast. We're very happy to have you join us today to discuss both the ongoing situation in Mali and also to kind of give listeners a broader perspective on the background to what's going on there right now. So I think that might just actually be a good spot to start. A lot of what goes on in politics in much of Africa, and I think West Africa in particular, is often a blind spot for many people for various reasons. So could you perhaps give the audience a bit of an overview of and background to what's currently been going on in Mali?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Really big fan of the magazine and really delighted to be here. Yeah, I think, for understanding the background, I mean, first of all, just the immediate background is on April 25th, there were, what a lot of analysts, journalists are calling the largest set of coordinated attacks in Mali's history. So attacks in the capital Bamako, attacks in other major cities such as Mopti in the center of the country. And then one of the biggest outcomes of these attacks was that a rebel group called the Front for the Liberation of Azawad, or FLA, retook the city of Kidal, which is one of the most politically important cities in the far north of the country. So I think, for trying to understand the background to this, I think the 2 key dates, I mean, we could go very far back, and I'd be happy to in the conversation if you'd like. But I think, the first 2 dates I would keep in mind would be 2012 and 2020. So in 2012, there was a major rebellion in the northern part of the country in which many of the same actors who just participated in these attacks were also very prominent. First, it originated as a kind of separatist rebellion in the north, and then relatively quickly you had groups who were affiliated with Al-Qaeda to varying extents, participated in and then came to dominate the 2012 rebellion. In 2013, France launched a military intervention, dislodged them, but then since then, Mali has confronted various forms of insurgency, especially in the north and even more especially in the center of the country. Then in 2020, in large part because of the security crisis and because of the widespread perception among Malian civilians and citizens that the French operations were failing and that the Malian civilian leadership was failing, you had in August of 2020 a military coup that brought the current rulers of the country to power. Initially, they had a kind of hybrid military-civilian transition, and then in 2021, the military junta took full power. They've ruled Mali since then, promising to end insecurity and delivering a quite brutal kind of, counter, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, counterinsurgency, counter jihadism, in partnership with Russian paramilitaries. So first the Wagner group, and then that was rebranded and kind of reformed as the Africa Corps. So the junta's been in charge of the country since 2020, but this has been one of the biggest blows to them. And a core member of the junta, who was also the defense minister of the country, was killed in the attacks over the weekend of April 25th, 26th. So, now Mali is it's been in full-blown crisis, but I think now there's an even deeper level of just crisis and uncertainty about what comes next.
So you briefly mentioned the separatists in the north. Could you give maybe a bit of an overview of who are the groups involved? Because you also briefly mentioned Al-Qaeda affiliated groups. So who are we talking about? Why are they involved? What are their motivations?
So there's been rebellions in the north dating back to the colonial period, if you want to take it back that far. But then there's been a series of rebellions in the independent history of Mali. So one in the 1963, one in 1990, one in 2006, one in 2012. And since 1990, there's actually been a decent amount of consistency in terms of who some of the key actors are. There's been different kinds of acronyms and names that they've gone by, but currently, as I was mentioning, it's the FLA, or the Front for the Liberation of Azawad, which is really, I would say, the latest kind of incarnation or version of some of the northern rebel and separatist groups. It's a somewhat broad coalition, so it includes people who want autonomy for the north, and it includes people who want a full-blown separatism, a full-blown creation of a new country that would be called Azawad. Sometimes you see maps circulate online with a division through Mali that would have the northern part of the country be called Azawad, which would take a substantial amount of territory of what's now Mali. So some of the actors within the FLA come out of the kind of what we might call the hereditary aristocracy of a certain section of the Tuareg, which is one of the key ethnic groups in the Sahara as a whole, and in northern Mali in particular. There's different kinds of subtle tensions within even the northern Malian establishment over questions of race even and lineage and so forth. But on the whole, there's been a heavy role for this kind of hereditary aristocracy at the top of the FLA. The even more prominent group on the attacks of April 25th was what's called JNIM. So this is Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, or the group for supporting Islam and Muslims, which is the group that's formally, part of Al-Qaeda's hierarchy. Although there's substantial debate about how much they really defer to global Al-Qaeda, or what even global Al-Qaeda would mean at this point. I should say, I'm on the skeptical end of all that. So I see them as a primarily regional group. They have a major presence in Mali. The top leadership is Malian. So this is, above all, two figures: Iyad Ghali, who comes out of the northern Malian Tuareg establishment, and then Amadou Koufa, who is from the center of the country, center of Mali. So they have at the top level, they have a Malian leadership. They're also highly present in Burkina Faso. They have significant operations in Niger and Benin. They have a kind of a small presence in Nigeria, but obviously that's very concerning for the Nigerian authorities. They've conducted attacks before in Cote d'Ivoire, so they're a regional group. Again, they're officially part of Al-Qaeda's global hierarchy, so one can make of that what one wishes. JNIM formed in 2017 as a coalition of other groups, some pre-existing groups. Iyad Ghali, the top leader, had participated in several rebellions, and in 2012, in that rebellion, he was basically a full-blown kind of jihadist and ally of Al-Qaeda, and has been in Al-Qaeda's camp ever since. Although, again, I think with substantial kind of autonomy and a fair amount of final say in the decisions that are taken at the regional level. So JNIM absorbed sort of his group and several other groups, including some of the largest Saharan battalions of what had been called Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or AQIM, which is still around to a certain extent, although they've been eclipsed by JNIM fairly decisively. In terms of JNIM and what they want, they had. They've targeted successive authorities in Mali, in Bamako. In the capital, they were major, vociferous opponents of the French when the French were there from 2013 until 2022 or so. A lot of their propaganda was fiercely anti-French. since the French withdrew or were kicked out by the junta, and since the Russians, in particular the Wagner Group and then Africa Corps, have been there, JNIM has been a fierce opponent of the Russian presence as well. Although now, and some of their messaging on the coming out of these April 25th attacks, it seems like they're trying to say to Russia, get out. We'll leave you alone if you get out. We have no sort of ultimate quarrel with you. I'm obviously paraphrasing their statements, but they seem to be saying we would like to see the Russian presence, move to the side, and then our beef is really ultimately with the junta in Bamako. So, yeah, those are the FLA and JNIM are then the two main groups to be aware of at present.
So, if you'll excuse me, because I've been very much out of it, I think, in terms of following these groups that closely. I stopped maybe 15 odd years ago. But just to kind of also clear up the picture, you mentioned briefly Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which grows out of the Jama'a Salafiyya al-Da'wa al-Qital in Algeria, which itself was an offshoot from, or breakaway really from the GIA, Jama'a al-Islamiyya al-Musallaha. But there is obviously that lineage, and now you said obviously this group is kind of related, but kind of has its own regional development. How do all of these relate to the regional branches of ISIS? Because I know that those are present as well, but they seem to be, as is the case with between Al-Qaeda and ISIS elsewhere, they're always in competition and rivalry. So what's the ISIS presence, and is it at all significant? Because I can see there are obviously some analysts who want to make kind of a big deal about this, and also often might conflate the two.
Absolutely, yeah. So and in fact, as I was wrapping up the last answer, I was thinking, man, I should mention the Islamic State presence as well. I think there's a little bit of a geographical kind of distribution, a sense of maybe loose zones of influence. So the center of gravity and the Islamic State presence has gone through different names. For a while it was called Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. Nowadays people often refer to it as Islamic State Sahel Province, or ISSP. But in any case, the Islamic State militants, their kind of center of gravity now is what's called the tri-border zone. So this is the kind of eastern Mali, northern and eastern Burkina Faso, western, southwestern Niger. There's overlap and there's conflict between JNIM and the Islamic State. There was kind of, and there's been some good writing on this, but there was kind of a loose, seemed to be kind of tacit non-aggression pact until circa, 2019, 2020. But then there's been on and off some pretty fierce fighting between the two of them. And the Islamic State sometimes has worked to outflank them rhetorically to accuse JNIM of being sellouts. JNIM has at various points had sort of transactional negotiations with successive authorities in Bamako, over prisoner exchanges, over other things. And then there's always rumors about kind of deeper negotiations. There was a point where both JNIM and the civilian president of Mali at the time, Ibrahim Boubacar Keita, were both at least notionally willing to negotiate with each other. And then the Islamic State at that point really was accusing JNIM of being sellouts. So sometimes the Islamic State is able to attract hardliners from JNIM's camp over to its own. But yeah, they have a substantial presence. I mean, they had even briefly, during the kind of chaos over the last couple of days, they had seized control of a kind of a provincial, center that they had been encircling and threatening for several years now. So yeah, I think, JNIM is pretty significantly more important kind of militarily and politically, but the Islamic State is a formidable presence within the region.
Do we know anything about the actors involved in Islamic State in the region? Like who are they? Where are they coming from? What are their motivations? And why this, besides this kind of claim to ideological purity, is anything else going on with the dispute with JNIM?
Yeah, so, for a long time they had a prominent leader, Adnan Sahrawi, who came out of the kind of same circles as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, who had been part of some breakaway groups, who then, progressively went more and more in his own direction. By all the biographical accounts of him, he's actually from the Western Sahara, as listeners may know, the territory that's disputed between the Polisario Front and Morocco. He was killed, I want to say, around 2021. The Islamic State was heavily, heavily targeted by the French forces. At times, they were targeted even much more than JNIM was. So a lot of their top commanders were killed. They also were involved. They perpetrated this ambush in 2017 against American soldiers and Nigerian soldiers in the kind of Niger-Mali borderlands. And that then triggered a massive kind of manhunt for some of the people who had participated in that. The Malian authorities, sometimes every couple months will say that they've killed this top commander or that top commander. To me, I find it somewhat murky. Sometimes you only hear the names of who the top leadership are, once they've been killed or once they've been reported captured. I think since the death of Sahrawi, it's been, figures who, at least to me, and I don't follow it as closely as I used to either, figures to me who don't have the same kind of like fame or infamy or pedigree. I think they've had kind of a mix of leadership. So there's been a couple of different leaders, not just this Sahrawi, but others who at least have purported origins from the Western Sahara. They seem to have recruited locally to a heavy extent. So they had some leaders who came out of the Pul/Fulani ethnic group, especially from the Nigerian side of the border. So I think, and at times seem to function in a very predatory and almost bandit-like way. But they have also found ways to present themselves as the champions of certain, segments of ethnic communities, herding communities, and so forth. So they have this kind of combination of, heavy extortion, heavy brutality, but also some kind of, foothold and alliance building within local politics.
So if we were to expand the regional analysis a bit more, because we obviously talked about Mali, but as came up in the conversation so far, the surrounding countries are all very much succumbing to similar dynamics, right? So Burkina Faso, Niger, and even, as I said, if you expand down to Nigeria and, of course, even North African countries, Libya, Algeria, and so on. How should one read the kind of regional context? Again, they're shaped by similar dynamics, but where do we draw the line?
Where to even start? Gosh, I mean, there's been a couple of different failed regional initiatives. So, for example, the French had backed what was called the G5 Sahel, and there was even a G5 Sahel joint force, which came into operation, I want to say, around 2017. There's been kind of persistently the idea that if only regional powers could collaborate with one another, could step up border security and so forth, then that would go a long way towards solving the problem. I think ultimately the causes of the insecurity have as much to do with politics, with livelihoods, with a search for order, with a search for justice, with a search for dignity, as they do with just hard questions of military power. So I'm not sure that there's a configuration of regional military power that would halt the insurgency. So I think that's one dynamic. And then more recently, you have the split between ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of West African States, which includes 15 or included 15 states in the region, and then you have what's called the Alliance of Sahel States. So this is or AES. This is then Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, all of which are under control of relatively new military juntas that came to power in 2020 in Mali, as we mentioned, in 2022 in Burkina, in 2023 in Niger. Those three juntas, those three sets of military rulers, have had a fairly strongly shared common outlook. So anti-French, they talk a lot about sovereignty. They talk about taking a very hard line against the insurgencies. So they have set themselves up as a kind of alternative to ECOWAS, or the Economic Community of West African States. They have, I think, inspired a lot of people through talking about sovereignty and through the desire to reclaim much more say for themselves, especially vis-a-vis France. But their security accomplishments so far are very, very thin, in my view. I mean, all of them have been rocked by the insurgencies.
This actually brings up an important topic. These juntas that you mentioned, the coups are often, as you said, in large part motivated by anti-Western sentiment, anti-imperialist sentiment, anti-French sentiment in particular. And then there's this push to reassert sovereignty, often by, again, claiming to maybe take a different approach to these insurgencies. perhaps most emblematic of this on the international stage is Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso. He's certainly celebrated as this kind of anti-imperialist figure. He makes these pan-African, claims and rhetoric, and is shown to be kind of posing a defiant stance to Western interest in Africa, and particularly French interest. But then simultaneously is a figure who cut his teeth in this kind of Western-led global war on terror. So how are we to understand these figures and these juntas? Like how do we, resolve this tension between this kind of claim to, anti-imperialism and Pan-Africanism, which seems to be quite genuinely expressed, but at the same time, the involvement in these kind of counterinsurgencies, which themselves are Western-led, normalize relations with Israel. How do we square the circle?
I'll start by saying I think, to the extent I can put myself in the shoes of their supporters and their admirers, I think I can understand a lot of their appeal. So I mean, first of all, I do think, in my view, there's been a lot of persuasive writing and analysis, characterizing France's policies in the Sahel and in much of Africa as neo-colonial, in the economic sphere, in the sphere of currency, in the sphere of politics, elections, the military presence. I think there would be a lot of reasons to feel that France had exercised a profoundly unfair and domineering kind of influence over these societies from 1960 onwards. And I think Emmanuel Macron, has been the latest in a series of French presidents, and maybe even to a greater degree even than some of his immediate predecessors, who's been almost just openly condescending and peremptory vis-a-vis African heads of state. I mean, there was a moment in, I want to say 2020, where he basically summoned the Sahelian heads of state to France to kind of, show a sort of solidarity or loyalty with him. I can well understand why that would really bother people. And there were also serious questions, to be asked about why the French military presence after nearly a decade in Mali had not, reverse some of the insecurity. I don't think it's because the French have any kind of, hidden agenda or something like that. But I do think that people were well justified in saying, why doesn't this work? Why is insecurity just getting worse and worse? I think also then the Sahelian civilian leadership at the time, at the turn of the decade from the 2010s to the 2020s, was often some very familiar, fairly old figures who had been core faces in politics dating back to the 1990s. I think there would be a reason why, younger generations would be just sort of very fatigued with seeing the same people come back again and again in the opposition, in the government, and not really getting. I think part of what appeals about Ibrahim Traoré is just his youth, and Assimi Goïta, the leader of Mali, is not that much older, in his early to mid 40s. So I think you have that. I think then there have been some, if one was rooting for kind of ending French influence and so forth, there have been some accomplishments on that side, kicking out French troops and so forth. I think that could really invigorate people. But at the same time, I mean, yeah, I think that there's elements of this that to me fall well short of a genuine kind of anti-imperialism. I'm trying to work on a piece now about the relations between the juntas and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. I think in that sphere, there's a lot of continuity in terms of conditional lending from the IMF, in terms of insistence on, cutting subsidies on things like fuel, cutting the public sector. This looks actually really similar to some of the structural adjustment programs of the 1980s. So in a lot of ways, and Traoré has really leaned into tying himself to Thomas Sankara, who was the Marxist revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso in the mid-1980s. But there have been, I think, some really convincing analyses. There was one in Jacobin recently by somebody pointing out that there's some real differences between Sankara and Traoré. Yeah, and then, they really came to power promising an improvement on the security front, and that just simply hasn't happened, and the latest attacks really underscore that.
So, it's good you bring up the Jacobin piece, because it seemed to have ruffled quite a few feathers, particularly among, anti-imperialist Western leftists who essentially turned around. And I think rightfully, there was this valid critique saying, look, back when Sankara was doing his thing in the 80s, Western leftists said the same thing, like, oh, he's not sufficiently leftist for us to support, he's not sufficiently anti-imperialist, etc. So what's new? On the other hand, there is I'm not sure, is it kind of a holding out of hope for kind of that anti-imperialist figure, or is it a, latching onto any kind of anti-imperialist gesture and kind of in hopes that it is something significant, that there is this rush to defend a figure like Traoré, where the way that the situation in the Sahel is often now framed is a very simple one, where, look, these are countries which are realigning away from Western interests in Africa, allying themselves, for example, with Russia, or perhaps maybe cutting deals with China, and that in itself is something worth celebrating. That in itself is something that is worthwhile, and that we shouldn't kind of be so quick to criticize. So how do we kind of make sense of this, or kind of navigate these sentiments that are often expressed?
Yeah, I think those are, those are powerful responses that people had to the Jacobin piece, and I think I agree with you. It's really worth taking seriously. I mean, no question that somebody like Ibrahim Traoré or Goïta in Mali, faces an almost impossible situation. I mean, who could succeed under these circumstances? I mean, the desperate poverty, even in the best of times. I mean, these are literally the poorest countries in the world. Then to inherit a really galloping insurgency, to be landlocked, to be highly dependent on more powerful neighbors, on different external powers. This is a really, really difficult hand to be dealt. I think that too, there's a lot to pay attention to in the way that some of the juntas have dealt with energy companies and extractive companies and so forth, to say we must have a greater share of royalties, we must have a greater control over gold or uranium or oil or whatever it may be from country to country. I can see why that inspires people. Yeah, I guess at the same time though, I think what gives me some real pause is two things. I mean, I think the treatment of the domestic opposition. I mean, maybe this is me, being naive and not understanding, the kind of. I think maybe people would say, look, a leader in these desperate circumstances is just going to have to crack down on opposition, just going to have to barrel forward. I can understand that argument, but I don't agree with it, because I think that the treatment of journalists, of politicians, of those in particular, of civil society activists, has just been really, really harsh in a way that I think, compromises basic kind of human freedoms and dignity. Conscripting people, imprisoning people, harassing people, disappearing people. This is a level of abuse that I find really objectionable. I also think that the triumphalism and sort of the denial of basic realities around how things are going also really troubles me. I think that there would be a way to lead these countries and to move forward that wouldn't lean so heavily on just this kind of denialism, a kind of search for an alternate reality, a media bubble. I mean, with Traoré, I think one piece of evidence of his popularity is all the AI generated content, all the media production, that goes into this. Rahman Idrissa, the Nigerian intellectual, was talking in his interview with Equator magazine about like the video man, like the kind of, professional Burkinabe kind of youth now who churn out videos or sometimes on a volunteer basis. On the other hand, I think all that AI content is also a sign of weakness. I mean, why would you need all these kinds of just totally fake, videos and speeches if the real project wasn't ultimately a bit thin? So, yeah, these are some of the things that give me some pause, I guess.
So speaking of AI videos, I saw something that came up in my feed this morning, which was an AI-generated video of, the recent clip of Ahmed al-Shara next to Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. But then it changes, obviously, from the actual clip to an AI-generated one where he kind of takes Abdel Fattah by the neck and he kind of throws him into like a tip or something. It just kind of rang something now when you were talking about like the maybe optimism, maybe false, misplaced optimism triumphalism of projects that are still in their infancy and still are very questionable in terms of their orientation. And it also brings me to the other question that I really wanted to ask, was the question about parallels with Syria. There are some who will be quick to point to Mali and say, oh, this is another Syria. Look, it's a very similar situation. You have this government which is aligned with Russia, suddenly ousted by jihadis, and jihadis are going to soon, maybe they're going to do what Ahmed al-Shara is doing. Other analysts who are more skeptical turning around and saying, no, these are completely different situations. The jihadi group in Mali, JNM, is not as maybe ideologically compromised or as pliable as HTS has become. So there's those who are saying, this is exactly the same. There's others who say this is very different. Interestingly, also, you have, I think, a significant portion of the Western left which looks at the situation and, again, kind of breaks it down in very maybe oversimplified terms, where they say, well, look, this is, again, Mali was a country which was moving away from alignment with Western interests, aligning with Russia, and now suddenly, oh, look, now the jihadis, which are obviously a cipher for Western intelligence manipulation, are here to make the realignment, as they did with Syria, let's say. So there's a lot of noise going around regarding this question of parallels with Syria. Are there any similarities? There obviously are differences, but how do we kind of chalk this up in terms of similarities, differences, any parallels whatsoever that we can actually read something from?
Yeah, thanks. I think this is a really important and fascinating question. I think I'm more on the side of the skeptics in terms of I see more differences than parallels. But I think to acknowledge some of the parallels, I think that JNM in Mali is clearly aware of the Syria model. They've clearly followed what's happened there. I think you could argue in a way that JNM is more parochial. From what I don't follow Syria as closely as I would like, but from what I understand, the Salvation Government in Idlib, HTS, was able to work with some really, really highly educated people, people with PhDs, people who had, studied in Turkey or wherever it may be, people who really had a kind of fluency with European politics, with global politics, with interacting with the United States. I think that Iyad Ghali and the leadership of JNIM and FLA, for that matter, I think they're highly sophisticated, but sort of on their own terms, right? They're highly sophisticated at dealing with the realities of kind of Saharan, Sahelian, Malian, et cetera, politics. So I don't see them having that same kind of like technocratic side to them that HTS did. I think that would be a problem if they went to try to rule Mali. I think also, estimates of manpower, well, first of all, are probably all more or less just completely speculative when it comes to JNIM, but they're quite a bit lower, So I think the kind of coalition that HTS put together, especially in 2024 for the big push, I'm not sure that JNIM would be able to command those sorts of numbers. You often hear with JNIM that they have 5,000 or 6,000 fighters. I've heard people saying now that's got to be far too low. That the kind of coordination that they demonstrated on April 25th, the reach that they have from far western Mali to into Nigeria, that must show that they have much more than 6,000 fighters. But still, it seems that they don't have the manpower to really take and hold Mali. I think there's a lot of debate right now about whether they'd be willing to break with Al Qaeda or not. Maybe they'd be less willing to break with Al Qaeda than HTS and its antecedents were. Maybe not. I think I could see a scenario where they. Again, Ghali has shown a pragmatic side. I think through a lot of his career, he came close to negotiating or he was at least willing to negotiate with something with the civilian authorities circa 2020. I don't think this is somebody who's just so hardline that he would never come to the negotiating table and talk in real practical terms. But I also think they don't have the kind of geographical enclave that HTS did in Idlib that would allow them to prepare, this kind of national assault. So maybe now they would have that, maybe with the taking of Kidal and so forth. But I think they're not in several ways, militarily, politically, maybe even ideologically, they're not where HTS was in 2024 So I would see things probably playing out quite differently. In terms of what you were mentioning about kind of the Western left and their suspicions, I mean, I do think that it's been striking and even to some extent like unseemly how much some of the DC think tank establishment has embraced HTS, including some of the very same people who in 2016 or so were arguing that their break with Al Qaeda was totally fake, have now become some of the most enthusiastic kind of supporters or kind of subtle cheerleaders for HTS. I do think that, and I can understand why there would be a concern that there's going to be a whitewashing of JNIM, that there's sort of the ground is being prepared for JNIM to run Mali. I myself, though, have long felt that some kind of negotiated settlement or negotiated outcome dialogue with JNIM would be the way to go, because I think it would save lives. I think that, it's a long-running conflict, from 2012 to the present. Even, pre-2012, there was some significant violence and instability in the north. I think that, any kind of political, not any, but, I think there might be a political settlement out there that would save some lives and stop, some bloodshed. Otherwise, I think we could look at the real fragmentation of Mali and just a real descent into shocking levels of kind of violence and chaos.
Two questions come up for me with what was just discussed. One, which you briefly alluded to, was this question of what even is Al-Qaeda Central, or the kind of international organization of Al-Qaeda. It's not really clear anymore, obviously, with the weird assassination of Ayman al-Zawahiri a few years back. No clear leadership. Maybe Saif al-Adl, who's kind of not under house arrest in Iran. But again, there's nothing clear, like, as far as I can see. And again, I admit I'm not somebody who is following this stuff too closely, but it is a big question of what even is Al-Qaeda as an international organization anymore. So that's kind of one side of it. The other side of it is what seems to be a sort of kind of normalization, first with Syria, now with Mali, and of course other places, whether in Burkina Faso or elsewhere in Africa. Same to an extent in Somalia as well, where you have kind of a normalization of jihadi groups coming to power or coming close to coming to power, which is certainly something that maybe, in the Al-Qaeda in its previous iterations might have dreamed about, but never actually came not even close to achieving, certainly under the, leadership when it was an actual organization under bin Laden and then Zawahiri. So it's almost like 2 points in tension. Like, does Al-Qaeda exist anymore? Or what is it, if it does exist? And then, on the other hand, this just our acceptance now of this is a reality in the world, that jihadi groups sometimes come to power. I mean, Afghanistan is, of course, perhaps the most striking example, but, that was them just returning to power, right?
Yeah, I think, to me, even at its height of sort of global, attempts at global cohesion, I think there was a lot of seeming autonomy for Al-Qaeda's affiliates and units. I mean, I think Barak Mendelsohn has a book called The Al-Qaeda Franchise that I think makes, for at least in my reading, makes fairly clear that there was some substantial autonomy for Shabab in Somalia, for AQIM. I don't even see sort of logically and practically how a lot of decisions, even in the time of bin Laden and, Zawahiri and so forth, how could a lot of micro decisions, day-to-day decisions have been really run past the central leadership, while they were on the run, while they don't necessarily have detailed knowledge of the politics and so forth. I mean, there was a lot of analysis circa, 2013 or so, 2014, about guidelines that Al-Qaeda Central had put out about how this demonstrated greater sophistication and so forth, how they, the central leadership had advised their affiliates to be, much more flexible and pragmatic. On the other hand, even those general guidelines can't speak to the complexity of local situations. I mean, and I think, with something like JNIM, where you have JNIM is technically nested under AQIM, which is technically nested under the central leadership. I don't know. The AQIM leadership in Algeria is a fraction of what it was. It's under pressure from the Algerian authorities. How could it be the case that, they would have veto power or even be closely informed about the sorts of decisions that that JNIM was taking. Even within JNIM, I would think at different levels, Crisis Group just put out a good analysis about JNIM's expansion. So the JNIM sometimes depicted as this kind of juggernaut, that soon will be in Accra or something like that. The Crisis Group report, which I think is quite sophisticated and careful, makes clear that there's some tensions within JNIM over expanding. So even at that level, I think cohesion is maybe hard to come by, let alone at the global level. So yeah, I don't see global Al Qaeda as all that meaningful. Definitely at this point, and maybe not even 10 years ago. In terms of the normalization of jihadis, I mean, it's a really, I think, important issue. I mean, I've been much more on the side of, again, engage them as you would other political actors, right? I mean, long-term conflicts in Somalia, long-term conflicts in Mali, now Burkina Faso, long-term conflicts in Nigeria. How could this end, other than through some kind of negotiated settlement? There's been examples of people who have come back into mainstream politics at the individual level. There's been different efforts at kind of dialogue and so forth. A lot of this is still uncharted territory, at least for the Sahel. But it seems to me there's been enough indications that there could be some sort of tangible dialogue or negotiation. I can well understand why that would be very, very ugly in some people's eyes. Would Mali, for example, ever compromise on the laïcité, on the secularism of the state? What would that mean for Mali's diversity, for religious diversity, even for ethnic diversity? What would be the position of women, for example, in a JNIM ruled or even a JNIM influenced Mali? These are deep questions that have real winners and losers once you start thinking of concrete answers. To me, I think, again, it's kind of saving lives and restoring basic functioning of the economy and basic functioning of the state, to me, is one of the highest priorities. But again, that's easy for me to say as an outsider, as an analyst, mostly commenting from a distance. The last thing I would say, I mean, since HTS came up, is just that I think the HTS example shows just, jihadis or former jihadis can be strikingly conventional in certain ways when they come to power, especially when it comes to the running of the economy. So in a way, I think they're actually less radical than they seem.
I think this is one of the more striking things in terms of alarmism around a group like HTS coming to power, especially as expressed often by leftists, when the line that is often put out there is that, look, these guys are these jihadis who are XYZ, and 10 years ago they were on a wanted list and blah, blah, blah. And now somehow we're treating them as though they're normal, which is kind of weird
considering
these are often people who are at the forefront of criticizing, let's say, the global war on terror. When the actual thing, I think the actual takeaway should be, look, this demonstrates to us the arbitrariness of the label of terrorist, because somebody who, 10 years ago is, has a bounty on their head for like 10 million or whatever, and now suddenly they're not because, they changed or we changed or the policy changed or the interests have changed. That just demonstrates the kind of arbitrariness of the label terrorist, rather than this other thing of how are we dealing with these people? These are the enemy, right? It's kind of weird to me.
Yeah, I really agree. I mean, I think that the war on terror looks it was always just horrendous. I mean, to me, it's just, but I think it looks really strange in the rearview mirror. I mean, just the kinds of, strange bedfellows you see now. And it feels like, a good portion of it was a kind of very violent theater. I think we're still in the war on terror to a great extent.
For sure, yeah. So this actually brings another question. How does one read what's going on at the moment in the Sahel in light of the US war on terror in Africa? This was obviously a kind of ongoing campaign pretty much from the get-go, from the 2001, 2002, and largely continues to this day. So what's the broad picture of that? And then maybe we can get into more specific questions as well.
I guess to give the historical arc briefly, I think after 9/11, I think the causes of 9/11 were really flattened and selectively interpreted in some very reductive ways. One of those was the idea, or maybe the dominant idea, was that there were so-called terrorist safe havens, ungoverned spaces, that these almost automatically could produce attacks against the United States. And so there was a search, or analysts and commentators and DC government officials cast a pretty wide net and talking about, okay, where are these ungoverned spaces that terrorist attacks come from? And the Sahel came up a lot. I mean, I don't think it was. I think of it as sort of like a tertiary theater in the war on terror. I think that even Somalia, Yemen were much more central to the war on terror than the Sahel was. But even from 2002, there was a program called the Pan-Sahel Initiative that then became the Trans-Saharan Counterterrorism Partnership. Then there were various efforts by the U.S. military, by Africa Command, to do all sorts of trainings. This is why ultimately you had American soldiers in a place like Tongo Tongo, Niger, in 2017. Going out on patrols. To me, the story remains somewhat murky, but I think at least getting very, very close to manhunts and combat. Who knows? And then ultimately, obviously, participating in combat once they were ambushed. Yeah, I think that the coups then disrupted a good portion of that, especially in Niger, where the American military had made the biggest kind of investments and presence within that particular region. After the coup in 2023, American officials, this was like late Biden administration, obviously, were very, very, I think, kind of high-handed and arrogant with their Nigerian counterparts, and then were kicked out. The Trump administration, Trump 2, has tried in certain ways, including earlier this year, to restore some security cooperation. So there's an official named Nick Checker at the Africa Bureau who's made a couple of trips to the Sahelian countries in the kind of Trump style of a very transactional, openly transactional, and I think he's used, in my view, quite cynically, some of the language of sovereignty to try to come across as understanding the political, vocabularies of the Sahel now. I'm sure that now a lot of that is being reassessed. I mean, I imagine there's still an appetite for trying to sell weapons or collaborate on intelligence sharing, but obviously the junta in Bamako now is in a very, very shaky kind of place. Yeah, and then I think that the French obviously had their own version of the war on terror, which I think did a lot of damage. First of all, I think that the French, and this is 2013 to 2022 in particular, they really placed an emphasis on killing top leadership and so-called high-value targets, and they killed a ton of people. They killed some of the top names, and it really didn't do much good. And I think that was part of what made their promises of bringing security ring so hollow eventually, is that they achieved their own aims, but then insecurity got worse. And then I think the French also, openly weighed in against dialogue at some key moments. There was a big call for dialogue in 2017, and the French pretty much openly said that they, rejected that. So, yeah, I think the French iteration of the war on terror did a lot of damage as well, actually, more than the U.S. version in this region.
To what extent might one talk about U.S.-French rivalry, or even U.S.-European rivalry in Africa? And to what extent are these dynamics that we're witnessing a reflection of that?
That's a great question. I mean, I think in statements from, successive administrations in Washington, Biden, Trump, Obama, there's been a lot more talk about U.S. competition with Russia and China, obviously. I think there was some real enthusiasm for, U.S. French cooperation, especially when the French initially did their operation in Mali in 2013. There was a book that came out kind of hailing this as a way of kind of quick, efficient counterterrorism, praising the U.S. support role. The U.S. did things like refueling of French military aircraft and so forth. So I think, in a lot of ways, there's been this sense of kind of like deferring a little bit to the French in terms of seeing this as their zone of influence, and then also seeing it as a kind of a productive partnership. But I think, and there are people who follow this much more closely than I do, but I think one could see sort of subtle elements of tension. I think at times U.S. officials felt that, that the French had a lot of baggage in the region, and that the U.S. had ways of productively distancing itself, saying, okay, look, we were never a colonial power in this region. We're just here on kind of be it the Trump kind of transactional basis, or be it a kind of, I don't know, kind of paternalistic approach, I guess I would say, from Obama and Biden. So yeah, I mean, officially, U.S. and France are close allies in the region, but I think one could detect some tensions there too.
So you briefly mentioned China and Russia. Obviously, that seems to be certainly a motivation of the US and its involvement in Africa, is this competition where China is obviously extending particularly its economic and manufacturing relations with African countries. And then Russia, often through contractors and things like the Wagner Group, which operates pretty much throughout Africa now. So maybe, if you could speak a bit more about that side of things.
I think the Russian presence has been a lot more visible in the Sahel in recent years than the Chinese presence has. So, the Chinese are present, for example, in Niger, in the oil industry. Obviously, like anywhere else, you have Chinese products. You have China hosting Saheli and other African leaders at key fora and so forth. But I think the Russian presence has attracted a lot more attention in Washington, the deployment of the paramilitaries, and then there's been a lot of talk and analysis, I think, in my view, overblown about Russian disinformation. I think there's definitely been Russian disinformation, but I think sometimes there's been a tendency in Washington to attribute, for example, the popularity of somebody like Ibrahim Traore or Assimi Goïta to Russian disinformation. To me, this is really, ignoring, sometimes almost willfully, the mistakes of the French, the way that the French offended people, and then also the real domestic roots of kind of the search for sovereignty. Yeah, I think, and now there's a lot of, obviously, I think discourse about Russia and Mali, discourse about Russia and the Sahel has sometimes veered back and forth between suggesting that Russia is very powerful and very formidable, this kind of ever expanding Russian influence. So there's been that kind of narrative, but then there's also been the narrative that Russia's not quite a paper tiger, but at least that they're not as strong as they look. And there's been obviously some open glee about the kind of setbacks and failures that they showed over the weekend. There were Russian forces in Kidal, this northern Malian city that was taken. I think what else to say? Under both, Trump and Biden, there's been, AFRICOM, for example, in its posture statements will refer directly to kind of competition with Russia and China. I think under Biden, I think that landed awkwardly sometimes. I think that the U.S. is perceived often as this kind of lecturing power that doesn't have as much to offer as it thinks it does. And I think at least from what I can tell of African leaders and some African citizens' perspective, Washington's framing of things as zero sum doesn't really land with people who say, okay, we can have multiple partners. We can work with, we can work with Russia, China, the United States, Turkey, the Emirates, etc. So I think, there was a good, it's not quite Sahel, obviously, but West Africa, at least, there was a good line. I think it was in a BBC piece about Kamala Harris's trip to Ghana when she was vice president, that she was, coming to give a lecture about China, but she was traveling into a Chinese-built airport and traveling along a Chinese-made road. So this, I think, symbolized some of that hectoring tone from Washington, but then not having quite the same level of just material, things to offer. I'll say the last thing I'll say on that, I think that a substantial amount of U.S. influence, for better or worse, in the region was projected, or at least Washington tried to project influence through USAID. So I think this is a major kind of change. The dismantling of USAID, I think, changes the U.S. presence pretty substantially in the region.
So you mentioned briefly that the U.S. not being a colonial power in West Africa, but of course we know, maybe not quite that, but we have Liberia in West Africa, which is obviously, for those familiar, the colony kind of established by former freed slaves from the Americas. And of course, Liberia played a very significant role in U.S. interests in Africa altogether, but particularly in West Africa, especially throughout the Cold War. So given Liberia's proximity to some of these countries that we're talking about, where does Liberia stand in these kind of ongoing changes?
It's a great question. It's frankly one that I can't really answer. I don't follow their affairs too closely. I mean, I think within West Africa, I think the key sort of interlocutors of the Sahelian states have been Senegal, obviously, because of the shared borders. Togo, which has been more sympathetic maybe than any other West African country to the AES, to the Alliance of Sahel states. And then Nigeria, just because of its political and military weight within the region. Liberia, to be honest, I haven't heard too much about their sort of engagement with these issues. Ghana, too, I should say, and Cote d'Ivoire, because of just their geographical proximity, have been key players. Yeah, it's a great question about Liberia. I really couldn't answer it, unfortunately.
So we talked a little bit about the, AQIM, or Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and that it's much smaller and much kind of less significant than perhaps it once used to be. As I had mentioned previously, so if you look at the history of that, we had the kind of coup overturning the 1991 election in Algeria, the Algerian Civil War, the formation of what was called GIA, or the Jama'at al-Islamiyya al-Musallaha, which very quickly kind of took I guess now we would call like a Daeshi or kind of ISIS type route in terms of the conflict in Algeria. And for that reason, that very much collapsed the civil war, and eventually you had breakaway groups like the Jama'at Salafiyya al-Da'wa wal-Qital, which eventually becomes AQIM. Looking at the kind of global scene in the early 2000s, it always seemed to me that the kind of Algerian group seemed to be a bit more cautious and a bit more maybe mature even than many other regional jihadi groups elsewhere, which might have circumvented maybe the kind of emergence of another ISIS-style thing. I think maybe due to their experience of Algeria in the 90s. Of course, this eventually did give rise to the regional branches of ISIS, so maybe there's something else to that, and I wasn't following things too closely by that point. But there was a certain point when AQIM was large and significant and had kind of alliances across the West African region, They would even, I remember in their propaganda videos, make a point of kind of emphasizing this, like the multi-ethnic dimension and the multilinguistic dimension of the group. What has happened since then? Like the group seems, like you said, to have dwindled very much. It's much less significant in terms of its influence, but then it has spawned these kind of other regional groups such as Jainim. So is there anything that maybe some insight into the history of the group and where things have gone since the inception? That's a
succinct and effective history that you just gave. I mean, I think that, and in particular, I mean, I've actually just gone back to trying to write a chapter about the GIA. I think they really did anticipate Islamic State slash ISIS in some key ways. I mean, particularly in just a really exclusionary kind of worldview and a very narrow definition of who counts as a Muslim, a very wide definition of who they were willing to kill. And the GIA, as you know, basically kind of ran itself into the ground by through purges, through. I mean, it all gets quite murky, and there's some serious debate among analysts about how many of the massacres in Algeria in the mid to late 1990s should be really attributed to them. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that they perpetrated a good number of those massacres. I mean, they turned the civilian population completely against them. They set up a situation where the armed wing of the FIS, the Islamic Salvation Front, accepted amnesty from the Algerian government, and then the remnants became the GSPC. And I think I agree that they had a more pragmatic outlook, and that seems to have really lasted through a decade or more of their influence over Sahelian affairs. I think the GSPC / AQIM, I think that the Northern Malian rebellion of 2012 was really a sign of their strength, and then also it was a real turning point, maybe even the apex for them, because they were some of the biggest. Their leadership was some of the biggest casualties of the aftermath of the 2012 rebellion. So I mean, it was a real sign of strength in that they became major players in the administration of cities after the conquest earlier in 2012. They were present in Timbuktu, in Gao in particular. Those two cities. And there's still, at the International Criminal Court, they're still sorting through some of the ramifications of what happened in Timbuktu. So on the one hand, it was a real confirmation of their influence. Algerian commanders were present, playing a substantial role in the running of northern Malian cities. But then the aftermath of this was, them losing a lot of their top leadership in French strikes. Mokhtar Belmokhtar probably killed in 2016 in a French strike in Libya. Some of the key Algerian-born commanders killed by the French over the years, culminating with Abdelmalek Drukdel, the longtime leader of AQM, being killed in 2020 in Mali by the French. And I think that was the real kind of end of their existence as a prominent group. I mean, maybe they'll come back, but I think to my mind, they've been much, much weaker since then. And in fact, I think Drukdel's killing in Mali was a symbol of how weak they were, in Algeria, to me. So, yeah, but I think that you could say, that strand of pragmatism, and it's interesting that you mentioned like the multi-ethnic, kind of multilingual kind of style and self-presentation of AQM. You see a lot of that in JNIM. So JNIM heavily Tuareg and Pul/Fulani leadership, but who did they choose to give the kind of one of the propaganda speeches after these attacks this weekend? They chose a Bambara speaking member, so they're clearly trying to appeal to or at least come across as coherent to a wide swath of the Malian population. So yeah, I think a strand of that pragmatism really remains, and then. With the Islamic State affiliates, I think that, they've definitely been very hardline. They've definitely been at times one of the kind of branches that the Central Islamic State was the most proud of and the most keen to trumpet in their propaganda. On the other hand, I think sometimes I think Sahelian analysts have made a good case that they're basically bandits. That they basically extort people. I think there's more to it than that. But I think one could say that they're at least a hybrid of some real hardliners, but then some real opportunists. But in any case, it's interesting how long it took for a group like that to reemerge in this region, because I do think that the GIA just left a long shadow of just this is a dead end for if everybody is an enemy, and if you're just going to kill anybody who's not a member of the group, this is a project that's going to burn itself out.
If we were to move a bit further afield, also kind of in North Africa, how might we read Libya? Obviously, Libya has had a very kind of tumultuous time after the Arab Spring and, the killing of Gaddafi. Now, it seems that Haftar has kind of established much more stability than he initially had. The country is more or less split into two, with, again, Haftar seeming to kind of be in control of most of the country. But what's the future of Libya, and how might one read Libya in light of these developments that are happening elsewhere, particularly in Mali?
It's really striking how much Libya 2011 still comes up, and how much of a debated kind of memory and the causality of that is really hotly debated. You'll find, a significant amount of Sahelian and West African leaders saying, look, the NATO-backed overthrow of Gaddafi is the cause of all of this, right? That's a key kind of talking point. I think then sometimes you'll have specialists of the region and other people really roll their eyes at that and say, look, there were rebellions in northern Mali long before Gaddafi fell. There was, there was the AQIM presence / GSPC presence in the region long before that. I guess my own take on that would be that I think the revolution in Libya did play a role. I think that it was not the primary cause, but I think it was an enabling kind of supporting cause of the rebellion of 2012 in Mali. There would probably have been a rebellion without it, but I think it was larger and better supplied and more powerful than it would have been otherwise. So I think it's convenient sometimes for Sahelian and West African leaders to say, look, no Libya, no crisis now. But I think they do have a bit of a point. Yeah, in terms of Libya now, what your question made me think of, and maybe, one thing pertinent to our conversation, Wolfram Lacher, a German analyst, had a really interesting paper about jihadism kind of going out of fashion in Libya. It's for SWP, the German think tank, and how, as there was a real peak in Islamic State influence there in the mid 2010s. It controlled, Sirte in particular, but also a swath of other kind of cities around that, portion on the coast, and it took massive kind of operations and firepower to break that Islamic State control there. So it's interesting to read Locker then talking about how since 2016 or so, what has appealed to kind of Libyan youth and potential hardliners in the country have been other strands of thought. Not, I don't know. I don't think jihadism is going to go out of style anytime soon in the Sahel, but it's interesting to read about places where it has. Yeah, I think that, right now, I think there's a lot of kind of discussion and questions about Algeria's influence. To what extent was Algeria informed? There's obviously speculation that Algeria was even involved in the attacks in Mali recently. Clearly, the northern rebels in Mali communicate with Algiers, and they visited there from time to time. Algeria reportedly brokered or helped mediate the exit of Russian paramilitaries from Kidal over the weekend. In terms of Libya, yeah, I'm trying to think what else. I mean, I just you would know better than I do. I mean, obviously, there's tons of questions about kind of relations between Chad and Libya and Sudan further east. I don't hear as much about Libya directly affecting affairs in kind of Mali and Burkina. There was a good piece from a long time ago by Ivan Gishawa and Frederick Descartes, two European analysts, talking about how Gaddafi was missed in the Sahel, how he was seen as this mercurial kind of personality, but he was also seen as somebody who could sometimes solve people's problems, and so his absence has been felt in certain ways.
There's obviously a lot of development happening in Niger, in Chad, and now obviously in Sudan. If you look, in that kind of sub-Saharan kind of belt, how might one read? Is there anything to kind of be read there in terms of influence, in terms of cross-border elements to the conflict, and of course throughout that, especially if you look at the case of Sudan, the involvement of other countries such as the UAE?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, there was a debate I saw on Twitter today even about why does JNIM get called terrorist, but the RSF doesn't get called terrorists? What is even? I mean, I think terrorism pretty much a useless sort of political epithet more than a serious analytical term. But it is interesting to go back to these questions about who gets labeled as a terrorist and who doesn't. I mean, Niger is deeply affected by all these, questions of jihadist insurgency. I mentioned for the Islamic State, Western Niger is a key zone where they operate, and then there's still what's called, Islamic State West Africa Province, the successor group to Boko Haram, which troubles the Lake Chad Basin. In January, the Islamic State Sahel branch attacked, the international airport of Niger. I mean, it's really, a key security concern for them. Chad, I think, it's interesting. I mean, Chad has a ton of security problems of its own, but has just not been troubled by jihadism as much as these other countries. I mean, there's been periodic clashes between Chadian forces and Boko Haram and Boko Haram's offshoots, but Chad's problems, have seemed much more to revolve around conventional rebels, for lack of a better word. I mean, rebels in the north, and then you probably know better than I do, but significant spillover from the Sudanese conflict into Chad. I mean, even just recently, I was seeing reports about intercommunal violence in Chad, about returnees from the Sudanese conflict theater, then having conflict once they came back to Chad. There's been a lot of interesting reporting about Mohamed Debi and some initially acting as a conduit allegedly for Emirati supplies to the RSF, but then more recently having tensions with the RSF. I mean, super complicated. Emirati influence in the Sahel, like in the central Western Sahel, I think is a really interesting question. I haven't seen or read too much about it. Hannah Armstrong had a really good piece for the Middle East Research and Information Project, MERIP, a couple of years ago, looking at just the multiplicity of actors attempting to influence the Sahel. France, Turkey, Italy, Emirates, even Qatar to some extent. I think this will be a really interesting question in the years to come as to what extent does Emirati influence grow there. For the moment, I hear obviously much more about Emirati influence in Sudan and Chad to some extent, Ethiopia, than I do about Emirati influence in places like Mali or Burkina or Niger.
Perhaps as a parallel to this, and earlier you mentioned the possibility of jihadism maybe going out of fashion in Libya. One thing that at least at a certain point wasn't going out of fashion in Libya was madkhalism.
Right.
Is there anything to read about madkhalism kind of further afield in Africa? Because we often hear about it in particular places in Yemen, in Libya, in Iraq. Obviously, then, in other places kind of influenced by the Gulf. But is there anything to be read about Madkhalism elsewhere in Africa?
Yeah, I've definitely seen some substantial commentary on this in Libya. So Crisis Group had a report about it at one point. Frederick Wary, who's I think one of the best analysts of Libya, had a chapter about this in his book with Anwar Bukhar's on Salafism in the Maghreb. A Nigerian colleague was telling me some interesting things recently about Madkhalism in Nigeria, in the northern part. I probably shouldn't say his name since I think it's early stage research. I'm not sure if he'd be comfortable with me sharing that. But anyway, look out for, Jala, some interesting research about Madkhalism in Nigeria. It's interesting in the Sahel. I mean, the most prominent, probably Sahelian Salafi overall, at this point is Mahmoud Diko, the kind of controversial imam who was based in Bamako for a long time, who was very involved in politics, who then left the country because of his differences with the junta and has been based primarily in Algeria since then. So it's interesting. I mean, in Mali, the most prominent example of a Salafi is somebody who's been very, very willing to confront whoever's in power at any given time, very openly critical of them. I haven't heard as much about Madkhalis in Mali or Burkina or Niger. But that may be gaps in my own knowledge. But it seemed to me that the sort of dominant Salafi posture has been much more like, that sort of activist, politically outspoken, posture, and jihadis obviously. But I haven't heard as much about Madkhalis in the central Sahel.
I mean, the other interesting dimension when one talks about Salafism generally and Madkhalism perhaps in particular, the last year was significant both in the in the passing of Rabi' al-Madkhali, but then also the passing of Abdulaziz al-Sheikh. So now obviously there was a slight gap and there was a big question as to whether they would even appoint a new mufti, but then eventually they did in Salah al-Fawzan. And I don't know if you saw, they went to the effort of purging his previous fatwa and kind of online presence.
Didn't see that.
People have recovered it and kind of exposed, because there's a lot of fatwas about like mermaids and things like that, which I think the Saudi government didn't want to have circulated. So, but this has been a kind of a question or a debate for a while, the question of the future of Salafism altogether. But I think it's all the more acute now in light of the passing of these kind of two significant figures in Saudi Salafism, certainly.
And it's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of blame against Saudi Arabia in the Sahel. A lot of people will say, well, all this goes back to, kind of Saudi funding in the 1980s or even earlier. But I think, one casualty of all the conflict has been that I think this is true of Somalia, many other places as well. I think dynamics in the religious scene, the nonviolent religious scene, are now quite poorly understood by outside researchers such as myself. I mean, I think there's figures like Mahmoud Diko, whom I mentioned, who's going to be very prominent, who's going to get coverage in, Le Monde or whatever, international press. But I think then there's a whole range of key religious figures who aren't that visible to outsiders just because, journalism has become so limited, academic research has become so limited. I think really there's a lot of, blindness about key religious trends in these societies at this point.
Thank you, Alex, for joining us. This is really great.
Thanks. Tried to keep up really, really great questions. I mean, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. And to our listeners, we do hope you enjoyed this episode, and we welcome your comments, feedback, and suggestions. Send us an email at proteanview@muftah.org. If you're hearing this on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, we'd really appreciate a 5-star review or a like. This helps improve the visibility of our show. With your support, we can keep Protean View running and gradually improve it. Visit us at muftah.org and navigate to the Protean View tab to see all our episodes, and follow us on our socials using the handle @ProteanView, including on Patreon, where you can become a paid patron and receive exclusive content. Until next time.